Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Validity Podcast. I'm your host, Valentina Rodriguez, and we have another episode today. And I know I always say it's going to be a short one, and then it never ends up being a short one. But today is actually going to be a short one because we're actually only going to be going through one study. It's a very recent study, and it's all about training to failure and or in close proximity to failure, and seeing if there truly is a difference when you take something straight to true mechanical failure or whether you keep a couple reps in reserve. So we're going to go through just that one study that we covered in a research review meeting that Dr. Buckner ran last semester. But before that, we have some personal updates. I know the past two episodes were part 2 and part 3 of our 3-part protein series, and those personal updates were kind of all grouped into the part 1 episode personal updates since they were all filmed on the same day and nothing revolutionary happened between part 1, part 2, and part 3 for me to have any new updates. But it's been, I think, like 2 weeks since I last recorded an episode. So we're gonna chit chat a little bit. So when it comes to what we're doing in the lab and in Dr. Campbell's performance and physique enhancement lab, we still have the reverse diet study recruitment underway. So recruitment is open for the world's first reverse dieting study. If you are interested in joining that, please email reversedietstudy@gmail.com and be patient because we have such a high volume of inquiries, but you will be responded to in due time and you will get all the information that you need in order to determine your eligibility and proceed with study participation if you are eligible. So definitely reach out to that email if you are interested in getting involved or if you just want a little bit more information about what your participation would entail. Apart from that, we got back from the International Society of Sports and Nutrition Conference last week. A bunch of us from the lab went along with Dr. Campbell. It's a 3-day conference. It was held in Bonita Springs this year, and essentially it was just a bunch of muscle, body composition, nutrition, health, fitness researchers sharing what they've been working on, what they've been doing. It's a research conference, but it's very fun. It's very laid back. It's a great networking opportunity. I met a lot of really cool people. I talked to some researchers that might be coming on the podcast. So we'll have our first guest episodes coming up in the near future, one of which is most likely going to be Dr. Escalante, Guillermo Escalante. He's currently the vice president of the ISSN. He's a researcher out in California, and he is super prolific when it comes to body composition, bodybuilding research. And he's just also a phenomenal person to just talk to and interact with. So I think that would be a really interesting episode. I did vlog my ISSN experience because I was balancing 75 minutes of cardio, killing all my macros, having all my meals, my lifting with being at the conference, watching Gretchen speak. It was a lot to balance, and it was a lot of bopping around, gym to shower to this to that to conference to back to sleep to oats. So I vlogged all of it, and that will be on my YouTube this weekend. So if you're interested in seeing the behind the scenes of the research conference as well as actual footage of the actual conference, then definitely I would suggest watching that vlog. So for actual personal updates, obviously still on prep. I did hit another new low this morning. We are very close to show day. I know my last vlog that I put out there, we kind of decided not to do the show that I kind of wanted to do. And we finally solidified a show date. And it's not like immediately, but it's in the near future, near enough that I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm honestly really excited to step on that stage because I do think I'll be bringing the conditioning that I need, if not very, very close to it. So just excited to get feedback when I'm adequately conditioned. I am very tired. My cardio did increase. I am at 90 minutes a day now. Feels like the final stretch. I'm trying to frame it as the final stretch. Food is a little bit lower. So we're kind of in the thick of it, but I do think it's going to be worth it. We know prep is a grind. We know prep is a struggle. So I'm in the middle of the grind and in the middle of the struggle, but I'm continuing to believe in the work. And that's really pushing me and keeping me showing up and working. And I just have to keep believing that the work will come to fruition in due time. So those are my updates. So now we can get into the actual science and determine, do we need to be training to actual failure, or is close proximity to failure adequate enough? And most importantly, does this study help us even answer that question? So the study that we're going to be looking at today is called Similar Muscle Hypertrophy Following 8 Weeks of Resistance Training to Momentary Muscular Failure or with Repetitions in Reserve in Resistance-Trained Individuals. It was published by Dr. Refalo et al. In January of 2024. So that's why we're kind of going through the study, because it was very recent. And I do think that it kind of sparked some conversation. I don't think it was like a crazy revolutionary paper, but it did spark some conversation. And I kind of want to talk about it because I think in general, what we have established without needing to do another study on it, it's been collectively accepted after multiple studies, anecdotal experience, published research, that in order to maximize hypertrophy, you need to be training very close to failure. Nobody has ever said you have to train to failure. I think it's been pretty well accepted that you have to train very close to failure in order to maximize hypertrophy. And we're not going to get into the nuances of mechanical failure versus technical failure and all these different things, because in my opinion, that depends on your goal for the movement, whether you should be striving for mechanical or technical failure. It depends on what muscle group you're training. It depends on, again, what the objective is of that specific exercise and that specific set and that overall workout, whether it's performance, whether it's targeting a specific muscle group. Like, there's a lot of nuances that come into play, and we're not going to get into those because this episode is truly just going through this one specific study. And I think that also this episode will help you guys get a little bit of a more discerning eye when it comes to reading research. So let's just kind of go straight into the paper. So essentially what this paper was trying to do was figure out, does it matter if we train to failure versus if we leave a few reps in reserve? And in order to clarify what RIR is, or reps in reserve, it's essentially a metric that people use when creating programs, when training, in order to gauge how far from failure you are training. It's an intensity gauge. So if I tell you to do a set with 0 RIR, let's say we're talking about like leg press, say do a set of 10 with 0 RIR, that means you need to be training at a specific load, which means a specific weight, at which your 10th rep should be the last possible rep that you can muster out. You should not be able to do an 11th rep. And it's a way for you to gauge, based on the rep range that you're prescribed, what load you should be using to reach that level of intensity, meaning that proximity to failure. So if I tell you to do a set of 10 with 0 RIR, meaning a set of 10 and that 10 should be failure, you're going to be going heavier than if I tell you to do a set of 10 with 2 RIR. That means you should be going a little bit lighter, because by the time you reach your 10th rep and you finish your set, you should know I had 2 more reps in me, because I was prescribed 2 RIR. If I tell you 4 RIR, that's a pretty low intensity set, because you're leaving 4 reps in your tank. You're leaving 4 reps in reserve. So when we talk about reps in reserve, it really is a measure of what your load should be relative to your rep range that's being prescribed in order to perform at a certain proximity to failure. I hope that makes sense. And typically, we've always said, like I just said, close to failure is sufficient for maximizing hypertrophy. And the study is saying, okay, now let's look at these really close to failure sets. Is there going to be a difference if we're training to failure, if we're leaving 1 rep in reserve, if we're leaving 2 reps in reserve? And another kind of thing that was used in this study is called a velocity loss. And so if we're thinking about training and we're trying to maintain a certain tempo, the closer we get to failure, the likelihood that our reps are going to slow down because we're struggling to move the weight. And a lot of times we use velocity loss, or the decrease in the velocity of your reps, in order to determine proximity to failure. So the greater velocity loss that you have, the closer to failure that you are theoretically at. And potentially the greater fatigue that you're experiencing, we don't really know. So in this study, they had 18 resistance-trained males and females undergoing an 8-week training intervention. They had 2 lower body sessions a week, and the lower body sessions consisted of unilateral leg press and unilateral leg extension. And what they did was they randomized each participant's leg to either the failure group, the 2 reps in reserve group, or the 1 rep in reserve group. So you were training differently across your 2 legs. My left leg could have been randomized to going to failure, while my right leg could have been randomized to going to 2 reps in reserve. And they did this for 8 weeks, and they measured muscle thickness using ultrasound. And they also measured lifting velocity of the first and the final set. And one thing to note that's interesting about this study is that in terms of set volume, they did use the individualized set volume method that was kind of popularized by Scarpelli et al. In 2022. We've talked about that before on this podcast. And essentially, the set volume for each participant was equal to the weekly number of quadriceps sets that they typically performed in their most recent training routine. And it was equally distributed between the leg press and the leg extension. So if you are typically training 10 sets of quads a week on the training program that you were on before you joined this study, then you were going to do a total of 10 sets per week of quadriceps in this study. So if we had 2 lower body days, we had leg press and leg extension, then you were likely going to do 2 sets of leg extension, 3 sets of leg press on one workout for a total of 5 sets. Then the next workout, you might have done 3 sets of leg extension and 2 sets of leg press for another 5 sets, totaling 10 total sets for the week to match the training volume that you were previously doing for quadriceps when you went into the study. And this is something that I'm not really going to harp on, but I don't think it's necessary to individualize training volume. I think we have objectively standardized sufficient training volume that a lot of literature points to, and you don't need to individualize training volume based on your baseline training volume. Because if you had a participant that's like, oh, I actually only hit quads 2 sets a week right now, what are they going to do? Be like, okay, we'll match that. So in the study, you're only doing 1 set of leg extension one day, 1 set of leg press the next day. You're not going to get any growth. And say someone's saying, oh, I do 50 sets of quads a week. They actually did say that if a participant was doing greater than 15 sets a week of quads, there was a 20% decrease in volume implemented to mitigate potential injury risk. And halfway through the intervention, all participants increased set volume by 20%. So a little bit interesting that they didn't standardize set volume in an absolute way. They standardized it relative to baseline volume. And some people might think that's a strength of the study. Some people might actually think that's a limitation of the study. The way we discussed it, we thought it was an unnecessary consideration to make, especially because they did not address what they would have done or what they did if participants came into the study with inadequate quadricep volume. They only explained the consideration they had if someone came in with excessive quadricep volume. So, set volume. So that is just a little note when we're looking through these studies. There's a lot of different considerations that you have to kind of think through when you're reading research. It's not just what did they do, what did they find? It's how did they do what they're claiming that they found? And is this an adequate way for us to connect the dots given everything they had going on and everything that they implemented? So again, it was 8 weeks long, leg extension, leg press, both single leg, because one leg was doing failure, the other leg was doing whatever that one was randomized to. There was no control group, so there was no group that didn't train at all. And one thing to know about the randomization process is that one of the legs was randomized to failure. So everybody had a leg randomized to the failure group. It just, you don't know if it was going to be your left or your right leg. And the other leg was randomized to either the 2 reps in reserve or the 1 rep in reserve. So yeah, again, they measured muscle thickness with ultrasound, and they measured lifting velocity of the first and the final set. How many sets did they do? Well, that depends on how many sets they were doing previous to the study when it comes to quadricep training volume. So now, what did they find? They found absolutely no difference between the groups. There was no difference in muscle thickness, no difference in growth. All groups grew the same. There was absolutely no statistically significant difference between the growth of the 2 groups. The legs that were randomly assigned to the 2 reps in reserve grew about 0.17 centimeters in those 8 weeks. And the legs randomized to failure grew about 0.2 centimeters in those 8 weeks. So a 0.03 centimeter difference that was not enough to be statistically significant. And you know what else was not statistically significant? The rep volume. So we've talked about this before in a different episode. And I can't remember what episode it was, but when you're reading research and you're pouring the time and the energy and the resources that it takes to create a study like this and to actually run the study and have participants undergo the study and do this for 8 weeks and then collect the data and analyze it and publish all of this, in my opinion, you need to do a better job designing your study to where you're setting yourself up to see a detectable difference. Why would you expect a difference? A detectable difference in muscle thickness after 8 weeks between conditions that don't even have statistically significant differences between the conditions. So between the failure group, the 2 RIR group, and the 1 RIR group, what you're trying to differentiate is whether the rep numbers in relation to failure are going to make a difference in your growth. But there's no difference in the rep numbers. There's no statistically significant difference in volume between the 3 groups. Because why would we expect when you're going that close to failure, 1 rep shy of failure, 2 reps shy of failure, of true failure, why would we expect those to make a difference that's going to be detectable on an ultrasound. You shouldn't. The other finding that was kind of notable, I guess, if you care, was that there was a velocity loss that was seen that was greater for the failure group. So for the legs randomized to the failure group, they did slow down more, and that makes sense because that to me just confirms that they were going to failure, that they were in closer proximity to that because they were losing more speed and they were, I guess, struggling more through that set. But in my opinion, the biggest thing that we have to take away from this is studies need to be designed in a way that ensures that you're going to get detectable differences. Why would we expect a difference between 1-2 reps if the 1-2 reps aren't even statistically significantly different from the failure group? Secondly, we know that training close proximity to failure maximizes hypertrophy. So I still don't really know why we'd expect to see a difference. It would have been really cool. I completely get the premise of the study. It would have been really cool if we elucidated, like, actually, you do get a little bit more growth if you push yourself to do that last rep that you can possibly muster. That would have been a really cool finding. And, null findings are also really valuable. So for me, the biggest takeaway of the study is that the way that they assessed failure, the way that they determined what 1 RIR was and what 2 RIR was self-assessed. So it's whenever they perceived that they were 1 to 2 reps shy of failure, depending whatever they were, randomized to. So to me, the most valuable takeaway from the study is that your self-assessment of being 1 to 2 reps shy of failure, granted, this is when you're being observed by researchers, so you're probably pushing even harder than you would if you're just on your own in the gym. So keep that in mind. But your self-assessment of proximity to failure is sufficient at being pretty close to failure to the point to where you grow just as much as if you had gone to failure. So that's pretty much the study. I don't think that I'm going to say too much more on that because I think that that's pretty much what I have. The biggest takeaway is that training 1 to 2 reps shy of failure by self-assessed proximity to failure is sufficient at maximizing hypertrophy as if you had trained to failure. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Always email me if you have any questions. Email Reverse Diet Study if you want to participate in our reverse diet intervention. Follow the YouTube and the Instagram for personal prep updates. And other than that, I will see you in the next episode.